Good morning. My name is Chris Adlam with Youth Pledge for Employers, and I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Gary Stebbing, the Museum Manager for the Norfolk and Suffolk Aviation Museum. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for giving up your time to join me this morning. And I guess my sort of starter for 10 question has to be, please, can you tell us about the Norfolk and Suffolk Aviation Museum?
Okay, so the Norfolk and Suffolk Aviation Museum is based on the Norfolk and Suffolk border at a small village called Flixton, and we are the home to East Anglia's aviation heritage. Basically, the museum is set up to look or sort of talk about and have exhibits of aircraft and exhibits that would have had connections with East Anglia specifically. We have 65 sort of aircraft and cockpits and over 60,000 exhibits in total at our museum.
That's amazing. It's one of those difficult things to get my head around. These are the kind of places where I say I've been on sort of, whether it was sort of school trips or sort of, past I've been in my spare time, you say you go to these kind of attractions, and I never actually think about what it's like to, as I say, to work there, as I say, on a sort of daily basis. So, what kinds of sort of, people and roles are needed to maintain, all these thousands of exhibits?
Well, basically, the museum, strangely, of the 100% of people that attend the museum, 99% of them are volunteers and 1% is a paid employee, which is myself. And the skills that we need really to run this museum is everything from people that are happy to come here and clean, to front of house operations, engineering skills, painters, electricians. We have an archive team. We have people that will work in the NAFI. We have people that work in our little shop on site. We have people that will greet people at the main gate. We have so many roles here that I think, it would be suffice to say that to talk about all of them would be too much.
I mean, well, I never realised that, I say you needed such an eclectic and wide range of volunteers and skills. As I say, I sort of, I probably go down the route of thinking, oh yeah, I can imagine the people in the shop and those kind of things, but I don't even begin to think about it. I say the volunteer engineers, and, the people to sort of service the exhibits. That's amazing. How do you go about sort of, I say, finding these volunteers, or do they find you?
Well, we've on our website, we're constantly asking for volunteers. And recently we were fortunate enough that we got some new volunteers interested in coming to volunteer at Flixton through a website called Nextdoor, which is kind of, to describe it in a better way, it's a bit like Facebook, but locally set up to our particular area. We get people come on that. We get people that just pop in on a public open day, and they'll come and ask to speak to me as a manager and say, love what you're doing here. Can I volunteer? Because we've got signs up around the museum that say volunteers are always welcome. In fact, just recently we had a young lady that came on the site. Well, I say young lady, she was in her 30s. She came on site and said she was interested in volunteering, so she got pushed up to me. I was working in the NAFI at the time, and we had a short conversation, and she was just fascinated by the museum, had an interest in Jaguar aircraft particularly, which obviously, if you know the area, they were based at RAF Coltshall just outside Norwich. So we took her on just off the basis of that. So volunteers come to us from all sorts of walks of life and through all sorts of different avenues, if you like.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's really interesting, yeah, as you say, to sort of summarise those different avenues and the ways that volunteers sort of can find you and you find them. That's really interesting. And so we sort of touched, as I say, there on the volunteer work, Paul. So if we look at your role, specifically yourself, as I say, as the museum manager, I mean, it sounds like you must, as I say, have to keep a lot of plates in the air then, as if you suddenly got all these volunteers with all these different skill sets requiring all these different duties. I know this is probably the most difficult question to ask any employer and answer, but if you had to try and describe a sort of typical day for you, sort of what would that involve roughly?
Well, the weird thing is there's two typical days for me here at Flixton, because we have two sort of setups. We have the behind the scenes setup which we call engineering days, which is a bit of a loose term, and we have our front of house days where we're purely open to the public. So excuse me, for example, I'll only need to be running the main gate, the NAFI and the shop, and then some of our exhibits. Whereas on an engineering day, I'll be looking at controlling the team of guys, and they could be different guys again, in terms of looking after maintenance activities that are going on. So the weird thing is I don't truly have a true typical day. It's broken down into two, a behind the scenes day and then a front of house day, and they both bring their own challenges and their own interesting happenings, shall we say.
What you've beaten me lovely to the next question there, actually, which is about those days. If you sort of had to talk about the challenges and the role and the sort of, you know, the good parts about the role, you know, how would you break them down and say what are your biggest challenges, what are your sort of biggest rewards in your role?
The biggest rewards for me personally, I mean, being around the aircraft, being around like-minded individuals. I've got a lovely team of volunteers that are always enthusiastic. I mean, today being a Tuesday, probably be looking at between sort of 20 and 30 volunteers that have given up their time today to come in and do engineering projects. And the biggest challenge really is making sure that all those individuals are all looked after, all got meaningful tasks to do, etc. On an open day, on a public facing day, the challenge changes in that I have to make sure that I've got enough volunteer manpower to cover the required areas. So the main gate, the NAFI, the shop. We also have cockpits that we open up so we can allow the youngsters to go and sit in a Lightning, for example. And we have 3 aircraft outside that we can open up. So the challenge really on an open day is making sure that I've got the volunteers available to do the roles and that they're happy and that we keep everybody fed and watered, and, you know, for the public.
I mean, that's really interesting to sort of hear the breakdown of that, and it's actually really refreshing to hear that. Say, sort of, you've got a lovely, motivated pool of of volunteers. I say that must make things so much easier for you, and I say it must be so rewarding for them because you know, I'm assuming sort of aviation is in the area that they all tend to be passionate about.
Yeah, well, again, like I said originally, we have people from all walks of life. So, I mean, for example, just as a quick example, I've got a doctor, an ex-GP, who volunteers here because he just enjoys running our little shop. So he comes in on a Sunday when we're open to the public, and he will just run the shop. So in the truth of it, you don't really need to be interested in aviation because it might be that you want to be purely front of house. However, having an interest in aviation, I believe, does benefit this particular environment, but it's not an essential, to be honest with you. A few of the people I've taken on recently are just keen to be involved with aircraft, and yet they've never had any involvement with civilian or military aircraft as part of their backgrounds.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's brilliant that they have that want to explore, as I say, a new interest, sort of maybe a new skill set, and you know, you've been able to give them that opportunity. And sort of on that, if there was a young person who's looking to volunteer the Norfolk and Suffolk Aviation Museum, as you've touched on, you've got sort of maybe different people who work in different areas, and you know, you may have different skill sets. If you needed some sort of, I'd say, some core skills to sort of succeed as a volunteer within, you know, the museum, what would you say they are?
Well, really, the core skills is you've just highlighted it, is to be a volunteer. I mean, I don't really need so much engineers. What I need is people that come to me who are enthusiastic to be volunteers here. And part of the process that I use when people come and see me to volunteer, I kind of do a very informal, I wouldn't call it an interview, we do an informal chat where I try and gauge where that person is going to fit into the environment here at Flixton. So, you know, but any skills that people bring to the table is great, because I have got people that have a vast engineering experience. I've got electricians that have years and years of experience, plumbers. I've got people that know how to operate the internet, etc., etc. But the truth is that if somebody comes to me to volunteer, I try and gauge what they can bring to the table. Because what I've found is, especially perhaps with the younger people that might not have the experience, is that I can slot them into particular roles that may benefit them, the museum, and the public at large.
Have you got any particular examples there, maybe, as a of young people who've maybe come to you, as say, to gain some experience and then maybe gone
Yeah.
on to do other things? Or
Yeah, well, what it is, I've got two at the moment. I've got one lad that's working as part of his Duke of Edinburgh award, and he comes because part of his Duke of Edinburgh award says that he has to volunteer for an organisation. So he's come to us and he volunteers, and he works on a Sunday. Sorry, he volunteers on a Sunday, and he volunteers in the NATFE. So he's assisting, doing teas, coffees, serving cakes, sweeping up, tidying up. So he's a classic example of a youngster. I have another youngster that I've just interviewed last week. He's going to come and join us. He's very keen in aviation. He doesn't have a lot of engineering experience, but he's just as keen as mustard, and he wants to get involved with the museum. So again, through that process of having a chat with him, have decided that we're going to put him in as a back of house volunteer doing engineering tasks, and we'll see how that builds up. So that's two classic examples from the off the top of my head.
no, that's fantastic, and it's really interesting, as you say, to sort of say that enthusiasm seems to be the sort of overriding characteristic you're looking for, and that, as I say, sort of, young people who come towards you have got these different opportunities out of it just by being, enthusiastic and willing, which is fantastic. Sort of one of my sort of final questions I'm going to ask, and I never mean this in a bad way, but I'm assuming you didn't wake up one day and thought, I want to be a museum manager at the Norfolk and Suffolk Aviation Museum. Not there's anything wrong if you did wake up thinking that, but I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit sort of a brief summary of sort of maybe your career journey and sort of how you found yourself in the role you're in today.
Yeah, sure. Well, my career started off, I left school and I went to work for a plastics factory where I lived, but my true passion had been to work with aircraft, and so I was lucky enough to join the RAF in 1982 as a weapons engineering mechanic at that time, and I did a career that spanned 22 years. I left the RAF in 2004, having spent a wonderful time in the Air Force, and then decided to follow some of my other passions, which were boats and vessels and ships. And I actually started off doing a bit of boat building. Didn't like that too much because it just didn't fit with what I wanted. And a friend of mine got in touch with me, and there was an engineering role came up for a marine engineer working for a local firm in Borough Castle, where I did lifeboat refits for the RNLI for 5 years, which amazed the RNLI surveyors, because they didn't realise that they'd got an ex-RAF weapons engineering technician working for them. So it presented quite a few interesting stories. I left there, and then I went to work for an oil and gas company. After that, I did nearly 10 years there. Unfortunately, was made redundant through the pandemic, and then went on to work for another subsea rentals company. And one night, my wife was looking on Facebook, and she was chatting with one of her friends, and she said, "You'll never believe this. There's a job come up at Flixton." Well, I knew about Flixton because when I worked at for doing the lifeboat refits, one of the gentlemen there was his uncle volunteers at this particular museum, and he said, "You must go and see this museum." And I said, "Yeah, no worries." So I went and saw Flixton in 2005, and as I say, weirdly, it came up as a job on Facebook, and I just decided to apply for it. And I thought, well, I've got no qualifications, but wow, wouldn't this be fun? So I sent my application off, and the rest, as they say, is history. I got shortlisted for the job, went for it, and here I am. I mean, it's like a busman's holiday, personally.
I was about to say that's a lovely journey, and it's brilliant how you've been able to follow and pursue your passions in a couple of different careers, and that's really interesting. And sort of my final question, really, just to sort of round up, and I've asked this to every employer I've done an employer talk with, and you sort of touched a bit on your journey there. But Gary, if you could go back and speak to, say, 16, 17-year-old Gary, about to sort of go out on your career journey, based on the experiences you've had now and the things you've learned, what one piece of career advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, the weird thing for me is, Chris, is that basically I was lucky enough to follow my dream. I dreamt of joining the RAF. Weirdly, when I was a child, when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, I used to fill in the coupons that were in the national papers saying, put your name and write off and get information about the RAF. And so I was lucky enough to pursue that. But I suppose what I would say to my young self is, before joining the RAF, is pursue your dreams. Don't let anything stop you, because like everybody says, nothing's impossible. I mean, originally I didn't think I'd ever be able to join the RAF, and then did a 22-year superb career visiting places all over the world that you might not have even heard about. But yeah, I think what I would say is that you know, follow your dreams and don't let people put you down. And what you need is people like me looking at the future, is that are willing to nurture you and take you under their wing and take on board everything that people like that tell you.